Good evening, dear listener. Come, settle in. Imagine the gentle weight of a warm cup of tea cradled in your hands, the steam rising softly, carrying the faint scent of chamomile or Earl Grey. Let the day slip away like leaves on a still pond. Here's a calm mystery, one to carry you gently towards sleep. If these quiet tales bring you comfort, do consider subscribing for more soothing stories like this one. Now breathe slowly, and let us begin. The soft glow of evening settles over St. Mary Mead. In a quiet cottage, a small leather-bound book rests on a polished table beside a teacup. Its cover is worn smooth from years of careful hands. It is called simply the Housekeeper's Ledger. Most would see only household accounts, modest entries for coal, groceries, wages paid to the daily help. Yet tonight, as lamplight catches the edges of its pages, one begins to wonder, can such an ordinary record truly hold nothing more? Chapter 1. The Quiet Beginning, approximately 1,000 words. Miss Jane Marple sat in the deep armchair by the window of her own small sitting room in St. Mary Mead, the one she had occupied for more years than she cared to count precisely. The fire in the grate burned with a low, steady crackle, sending little tongues of orange light dancing across the faded chintz cushions and the worn Persian rug. Outside, the late autumn afternoon had already surrendered to dusk. The sky was the soft gray blue of a pigeon's wing, and the village lay wrapped in that particular hush that comes when lamps are lit one by one behind lace curtains. She had spent the morning in her usual gentle routine. First, the inspection of the larder. 6 jars of damson jam still sealed properly from the summer. 2 pots of quince jelly waiting to be labeled. A small wedge of cheddar wrapped in muslin, and the last of the apples from the tree by the back gate. Tart, green, and excellent for pies. Then came the small ledger of her own household. The coal merchant's bill paid in full. The greengrocer's account settled to the last farthing. The weekly sum set aside for the charwoman who came on Tuesdays and Fridays. Everything balanced, everything in its place. Order, Miss Marple always maintained, was the quiet foundation of a contented life. It was shortly after luncheon, cold lamb with mint sauce followed by a slice of seed cake, that the note had arrived from Mrs. Eleanor Price. Delivered by the boy from the post office on his bicycle, in the envelope was thick cream-laid paper addressed in a hand that trembled just slightly. Miss Marple had opened it at once, recognizing the faint scent of lavender water that always clung to Mrs. Price's correspondence. "My dear Jane," it began, "I hope this finds you well and your garden still blooming despite the nip in the air. I find myself in rather a quandary and would be most grateful for your calm good sense. Since my dear husband's passing last spring, the running of Willowmere has fallen almost entirely into the hands of our housekeeper, Mrs. Agnes Harrow. She is, as you know, a most capable woman. Quiet, efficient, never a word out of place. The house has never been so smoothly managed, even in the days when poor Henry was well enough to notice such things. Yet I confess a small restlessness. I should like to feel I understand the household accounts myself, rather than simply trusting they are correct. Would you, dear Jane, be willing to cast your eye over the ledger? Not as an auditor, of course, nothing so formal or alarming, but simply as a friend who has always had a knack for seeing what others might overlook. I shall be quite at home tomorrow afternoon if it suits you. There will be tea, and I have a new blend of Darjeeling I think you will enjoy. With warmest affection, Eleanor." Miss Marple had smiled as she folded the letter. Mrs. Price, Eleanor, was one of those gentle souls who, even in widowhood, continued to worry more about inconveniencing others than about her own comfort. Willowmere was the largest house on the edge of the village, ivy-clad with tall windows and a gravel drive that crunched pleasantly underfoot. Mr. Price had been a solicitor in his working years, careful with money, fond of order, and quietly generous to the parish charities. His death had been peaceful, expected after a long illness, and the village had mourned him with proper restraint. Mrs. Harrow, the housekeeper, had come to Willowmere perhaps 18 months before Mr. Price's final decline. Recommended by the vicar's wife, who knew everyone worth knowing in domestic service, she had proved exactly as promised. Reliable, unobtrusive, skilled at stretching a joint of beef into 3 meals without anyone feeling deprived. She was a woman of perhaps 45, with graying hair pinned neatly beneath a cap, a plain face that gave nothing away, and hands that moved with the economical grace of long habit. Miss Marple had accepted the invitation without hesitation. The following afternoon she walked the short distance to Willowmere, her knitting bag over one arm. Inside it, the usual wool and needles in case there should be a moment for turning a heel, and a small tin of her own shortbread as a contribution to tea. The gate was open, the chrysanthemums still holding their bronze and purple heads along the path, and the air carried the faint, comforting smell of wood smoke. Mrs. Price greeted her in the hall, thinner than last spring but still elegant in her mourning black, relieved by a touch of old lace at the throat. "Dear Jane, how good of you to come. I feel quite foolish troubling you over such a small thing." "Not foolish at all," Miss Marple replied gently. "One likes to know one's own house, as you say, and ledgers are such revealing little books, aren't they? They tell stories if one listens." They moved into the morning room, where a low fire burned and the tea tray waited on a small rosewood table. Mrs. Price poured with careful hands, and for a little while they spoke of village matters, the new curate's first sermon, the disappointing yield of blackberries this year, the rumor that old Mrs. Beddoes might finally sell her cottage to the young couple from London. Then Mrs. Price gestured toward the escritoire in the corner. "There it is, the ledger. Mrs. Harrow keeps it so neatly. She brings it to me each month to sign the totals, but I have never really studied the pages. I thought perhaps, if you would be so kind." Miss Marple crossed to the desk and opened the black leather cover. The housekeeper's ledger, the title page read in careful copperplate. Below it, the dates began 4 years earlier and ran forward in unbroken sequence. She turned the pages slowly, her eye traveling down the columns with the quiet attention she gave to everything. Coal, 18 shillings and 9pence paid promptly. Grocer, £3, 4 shillings and 2pence halfpenny. Butcher, £1, 17 shillings wages. Gardener, 12 shillings weekly. Daily girl, 5 shillings. Mrs. Harrow's own salary entered monthly at £32. Laundry soap, candles, paraffin for the lamps, all entered with date, amount, and a tiny tick when settled. It was, on the surface, a model of domestic order. No extravagance, no carelessness, no unexplained gaps. Miss Marple felt a small glow of approval. A well-kept house was a small miracle in an uncertain world. She settled into the chair beside the escritoire, accepted another cup of tea, and continued turning the pages with the same gentle interest one might give to a familiar novel read many times before. The fire popped softly. The clock on the mantel ticked. Outside, the dusk deepened, and the first star appeared above the elms. Here, in this quiet room, with the ledger open before her, the story of an ordinary household unfolded in shillings and pence. And yet, as Miss Marple's finger traced a line of figures, she felt the faintest stirring of curiosity, the kind that comes when something perfectly ordinary begins ever so slightly to seem not quite ordinary after all. Chapter 2. Something slightly unusual, approximately 1,000 words. Miss Marple remained seated at the escritoire in the morning room of Willowmere long after Mrs. Price had excused herself to rest her eyes for half an hour, and the tea had cooled in its cup, forgotten. The fire had settled into a bed of soft red embers that gave off more warmth than light. She turned the pages of the housekeeper's ledger with deliberate care, not rushing, simply allowing her eye to travel down each column as though she were reading a familiar letter from an old friend. The household entries continued in the same impeccable hand. Monday the 14th. Paraffin oil, 1 gallon, 3 shillings and 9 pence. Tuesday the 15th. Laundry blue, 6 pence. Kitchen soap, 1 shilling and 2 pence. Wednesday the 16th. Milkman's account settled, £1, 4 shillings and 6 pence for the month. Thursday the 17th. Butcher's delivery. Leg of mutton, 4 shillings and 8 pence. Suet, 10 pence. Friday the 18th. Greengrocer, potatoes, carrots, onions, total 1 shilling and 11 pence halfpenny. Saturday the 19th. Wages paid to the Daily Girl, 5 shillings in cash. Receipt signed with a small cross. Everything as it should be. Precise, predictable. The sort of accounts that would make any careful housewife nod in quiet approval. And then, on the page for the previous month, October, she saw it again. Tuesday the 8th of October, sundries, personal, 12 shillings and 6 pence. She turned back further. August the 13th, the same entry. April the 9th, December the 11th of the year before. Every fourth Tuesday, without variation, without fail, the identical sum appeared. 12 shillings and 6 pence, entered under sundries, personal. No explanation followed, no receipt pinned to the page, no marginal note. Simply the figure, the date, and Mrs. Harrow's neat little tick to indicate it had been paid from the household cash box. And Miss Marple paused, her finger resting lightly on the most recent entry. 12 shillings and 6 pence was not a trifling amount for personal sundries, not extravagant certainly, but noticeable in a household where even a new scrubbing brush was entered at 4 pence. Yet it was not the size of the sum that held her attention. It was the rhythm. Every fourth Tuesday, like clockwork. She closed the ledger for a moment and looked around the room. The morning room was as comfortable and unpretentious as the rest of Willowmere. A small escritoire of walnut, a chintz-covered sofa, 2 wing chairs drawn up to the hearth, shelves lined with bound volumes of sermons, household hints, and a few well-thumbed novels from the circulating library. On the mantelpiece stood a photograph in a silver frame, Mr. and Mrs. Price on their wedding day, both young, both smiling with the shy certainty of people who expected life to be kind. Nothing in the room suggested secrets or shadows. And yet here, in this most ordinary of books, lay a small, repeating pattern that refused to blend perfectly into the whole. Miss Marple opened the ledger once more and began counting backwards. The first such entry appeared on Tuesday, the 10th of February, 4 years and 2 months earlier, almost to the week after Mrs. Harrow had first arrived at Willowmere. Before that date, the ledger showed no personal sundries at all under Mrs. Harrow's tenure. The previous housekeeper, a Mrs. Finch who had left to care for an invalid sister, had occasionally noted small personal items, hairpins, 6 pence, or postage stamp, 1 penny, but never in such regular, identical amounts. She leaned back in the chair, folding her hands in her lap. 12 shillings and 6 pence. What might that purchase every fourth Tuesday? A second-class railway return to a town some distance away would cost roughly that sum, she reflected. Perhaps a little more now, with fares having risen, but 4 years ago it would have been close. Or a modest parcel of groceries sent to someone unable to shop for themselves. Or a contribution to a burial club. Or a small weekly payment toward a debt long past. All ordinary possibilities. Yet none of them explained why the entry was placed so deliberately in the household ledger, rather than kept in a private memorandum book of the kind most housekeepers maintained for their own affairs. Mrs. Harrow was not careless. That much was clear from every other page. She balanced the cash box to the halfpenny. He noted when a tradesman had given short weight on potatoes. Recorded even the purchase of a single reel of black thread at 2p. A woman so meticulous would surely keep her personal expenses separate, unless, of course, she wished them to be seen. Or, conversely, wished them to be hidden in the very place where no one would think to look for anything irregular. Miss Marple heard footsteps in the passage. Mrs. Price returned, a little color back in her cheeks after her rest. "Well, Jane, have you found anything amiss?" Miss Marple smiled and closed the ledger gently. "Nothing amiss at all, my dear. The accounts are kept with admirable care. Mrs. Harrow is clearly a treasure." Mrs. Price gave a small sigh of relief. "I thought as much, but one does like to be sure. Will you stay for another cup? And the Darjeeling is really very nice." "I should like that," Miss Marple replied. "And perhaps, if it is no trouble, I might borrow the ledger for a day or two. There are 1 or 2 small totals I should like to check against my own memory of prices in the village. Nothing important, only my own curiosity." "Of course, take it as long as you like." When Miss Marple left Willowmere an hour later, the ledger rested safely in her knitting bag beside the half-finished sock and the tin of shortbread, now considerably lighter. The evening air was crisp. The first stars had begun to prick the sky above the elms. She walked home slowly, greeting the few neighbors who passed, exchanging the usual small remarks about the weather and the shortening days. Inside her own cottage, she lit the parlor lamp, drew the curtains against the night, and then placed the ledger on her own small table beside her favorite chair. She did not open it at once. Instead, she made herself a fresh pot of tea, cut a slice of the seed cake she had baked 2 days earlier, and settled down with her knitting. Only then did she open the book again, this time at the very first page of the regular entries. Every 4th Tuesday, 12 shillings and 6p, sundries, personal. A small thing, perhaps. A detail so modest it might have escaped notice forever. But Miss Marple had long ago learned that the smallest stone, when turned over, sometimes reveals the print of a foot that does not quite match the others. She smiled to herself, a quiet, thoughtful smile, and began to knit once more, the needles clicking softly in the lamplight. Chapter 3. Gentle Observations, approximately 1,000 words. The following morning broke clear and crisp. A light frost silvered the grass along the lanes of St. Mary Mead, and the air held that clean, sharp scent that promises a fine, still day. Miss Marple rose at her usual hour, drew back the curtains to let in the pale winter light, and prepared her breakfast with the same quiet ritual she had followed for decades. A pot of tea, 2 slices of toast spread thinly with butter and marmalade, and a small dish of stewed prunes. While the kettle sang, she glanced once more at the housekeeper's ledger, now resting open on the kitchen dresser beside her own modest accounts book. She did not reread the figures this morning. Instead, she allowed the pattern to settle in her mind like sediment in a pond. Every 4th Tuesday, 12 shillings and 6p, sundries, personal. A small, steady pulse running through the otherwise flawless record of Willowmere's domestic life. After breakfast, she put on her good walking shoes, her warm wool coat, and the soft felt hat she favored in colder weather. Her knitting bag went over her arm as always. Inside it, beside the half-finished sock and a spare ball of gray wool, lay the borrowed ledger wrapped carefully in a clean tea towel. She set off along the lane that wound past the churchyard, past the row of almshouses, and eventually toward the long gravel drive of Willowmere itself. She had no particular appointment. Mrs. Price had not expected her again so soon. But Miss Marple had long believed that the best way to understand a household was not only to study its books, but to observe its rhythms in the ordinary light of day. She reached the iron gates of Willowmere just as the clock in the village church struck 10. The house stood as it always had, solid, ivy-clad, its tall windows reflecting the pale sky. Smoke rose in a thin, steady column from the kitchen chimney. Someone was baking, perhaps, or heating water for the morning's tasks. Miss Marple did not enter by the front door. Instead, she followed the narrower path that ran along the side of the house, past the coal shed and the drying green to a spot where she could see both the kitchen door and the garden beyond without appearing to linger unduly. She paused beside a bed of late-blooming Michaelmas daisies, pretending to admire their lavender heads nodding in the slight breeze. From here, the morning activity of the house unfolded like a slow, silent play. First came the daily girl Elsie, a sturdy 16-year-old with red cheeks and a brisk step. She appeared at the side door carrying a pail of ashes, emptied them into the bin by the coal shed, then returned inside with an armful of kindling. A few minutes later, the back door opened again and Mrs. Agnes Harrow stepped out. She wore her usual plain dark dress covered by a spotless white apron, her hair pinned tightly beneath the housekeeper's cap. In her hand was the familiar string bag, small, brown, of good quality canvas, the same one Miss Marple had noticed on previous visits. Today, however, the bag appeared quite empty, hanging limp at her side. Mrs. Harrow closed the door behind her with a soft click, glanced briefly toward the garden, her gaze passing over Miss Marple without recognition or perhaps without interest, and set off down the path toward the village. Her pace was measured, neither hurried nor dawdling. Precisely the walk of someone who knows exactly how much time is allowed for an errand and intends to use it all. Miss Marple waited until the housekeeper had disappeared around the bend in the lane, then followed at a discreet distance. She kept to the grass verge where her footsteps made no sound, nodding politely to old Mr. Hawker, who was sweeping his front path, and to young Mrs. Simpson pushing her pram toward the butcher's. No one thought it strange to see Miss Marple out walking. She was often seen on the lanes at this hour, taking a breath of air, as she called it. Mrs. Harrow did not turn toward the high street with its shops and post office, and instead she continued along the narrower footpath that branched off toward the old almshouses and the little disused chapel beyond. The path was quiet, bordered by bare hawthorn hedges and the occasional holly bush bright with berries. Miss Marple slowed her pace further, allowing more distance to open between them. At the almshouses, Mrs. Harrow paused. She spoke briefly to old Mrs. Trimble, who sat on the bench outside her door knitting a sock very like the one in Miss Marple's bag. The conversation was short, perhaps no more than a greeting and an inquiry after health. Then Mrs. Harrow continued past the row of low stone cottages and turned down the lane that led to the chapel. The chapel itself had not been used for regular services in 20 years. Its windows were shuttered, its graveyard overgrown with ivy and self-sown ash saplings, and yet someone kept the gate oiled and the path swept. Mrs. Harrow disappeared through the lich gate. Miss Marple did not follow immediately. She remained at the corner, half hidden by a tall yew, and waited. 10 minutes passed, 15. Then the housekeeper reappeared, walking more slowly now. The string bag, still empty when she had left Willowmere, now bulged slightly at the bottom. Not heavily, whatever was inside was small and light, but enough to change the hang of the bag against her hip. Mrs. Harrow retraced her steps without haste. She passed the almshouses again, nodded once more to Mrs. Trimble, and continued back toward the village. Miss Marple turned aside into a side lane, circled round by the vicarage garden, and arrived back at Willowmere's gate just as Mrs. Harrow was letting herself in at the side door. Later that afternoon, over tea with Mrs. Price in the morning room, Miss Marple asked a few gentle questions. "Mrs. Harrow seems so very regular in her ways," she observed, stirring her tea slowly. "Does she take her half-day every fourth Tuesday without fail?" Mrs. Price smiled fondly. "Indeed she does. Like clockwork, she says she visits an elderly cousin in Lower Puddleton. Poor old thing, quite alone now. I never press her for details. One likes to respect a person's private time, don't you think?" "Quite so," Miss Marple agreed. "And she always returns punctually?" "Always. Tea is never late because of it. She is most considerate." Miss Marple nodded, accepted a second slice of seed cake, and let the conversation drift to safer topics. The new curtains in the drawing room, the difficulty of getting good lavender soap these days. Yet all the while, in the quiet of her mind, she pictured the small string bag, empty on the outward journey, lightly burdened on the return. The quiet path to the old chapel. The careful, unremarkable rhythm of a woman who moved through her days with the precision of long habit. Small observations, each one modest in itself. But taken together, they formed a pattern as regular and insistent as the entries in the ledger. Miss Marple finished her tea, thanked Mrs. Price warmly, and walked home through the gathering dusk with the borrowed book still safe in her knitting bag. That evening, by her own fireside, she opened the ledger once more. Not to the figures this time, but simply to look at the handwriting. Neat. Controlled. Telling its story one careful line at a time. Chapter 4. A calm contradiction. Approximately 1,000 words. That evening, as after her walk and her tea with Mrs. Price, Miss Marple returned to her own small sitting room with the borrowed ledger still wrapped safely in its tea towel inside her knitting bag. The fire had been banked up earlier and now burned with a steady, comforting glow. She drew the curtains against the chill night air, lit the reading lamp beside her favorite chair, and settled down with a fresh pot of tea and the half-finished sock on her needles. She did not open the ledger at once. Instead, she allowed herself a few minutes of ordinary knitting. Click, click, click. The rhythm familiar and calming, the gray wool lengthening row by row. Only when the sock had grown another inch did she set the needles aside, pour a second cup of tea, and draw the black leather book onto her lap. She began not with the recent pages, but further back, 3 years, 4 years, searching for the moment the pattern had begun. There it was again, Tuesday the 10th of February, 4 years and 2 months earlier. Sundries, personal, 12 shillings and sixpence. And every fourth Tuesday thereafter, the same entry, the same sum, the same neat tick. Before that date, nothing of the kind appeared under Mrs. Harrow's careful hand. The ledger had been perfectly ordinary, tradesmen's bills, wages, small household purchases, all entered without repetition or mystery. Miss Marple turned forward again, comparing the personal entries against the rest of the household expenditure. Here lay the calm contradiction that had been waiting quietly to reveal itself. Since Mrs. Harrow's arrival at Willowmere, the overall running costs of the house had not risen. If anything, they had become slightly more economical. The coal bill for last winter had been £3 less than the winter before Mrs. Harrow came. The grocer's monthly account showed a steady but modest decline. Fewer extravagances, perhaps, or better management of leftovers. The butcher's deliveries remained regular, but the totals balanced lower than in Mr. Price's final year of illness, when extra nourishing foods had been ordered. Laundry, candles, paraffin, even the small sums for window cleaning and chimney sweeping, all remained stable or slightly reduced. Mrs. Harrow had stretched every shilling with quiet skill. And yet, over those same 4 years, She had drawn from the household cash box the precise sum of 12 shillings and sixpence every fourth Tuesday, without fail, in without explanation beyond the two words, sundries, personal. The total withdrawn in this way amounted to something over £30 a year, not a fortune, but a noticeable sum in a carefully managed household. Miss Marple closed the ledger for a moment and gazed into the fire. If Mrs. Harrow had been careless or dishonest, one would expect to see shortages elsewhere, a coal bill left unpaid, a grocer complaining of slow settlement, a sudden need for extra cash from Mrs. Price. None of these things had occurred. The household books balanced perfectly. The cash box, when checked at month's end, always matched the ledger to the last farthing. Mrs. Price had never once mentioned a shortfall or an unexpected expense, so here was the quiet puzzle. A woman who managed every detail of a large establishment with exemplary care had chosen to record her own modest personal expenditure inside the household ledger, rather than in a private notebook of her own. And she had done so with perfect regularity, the same amount on the same schedule, as though it were a fixed obligation no different from the milkman's bill or the gardener's wages. If the money had been taken dishonestly, the household would have felt it. If it had been taken carelessly, the accounts would have shown small discrepancies. But neither was the case. The contradiction lay not in missing money, but in the deliberate placement of something private within a record meant for the household alone. Miss Marple opened the book again and studied the handwriting more closely. In the entries for household items were written in the same neat copperplate as the personal ones. No difference in pressure, no hesitation, no variation in ink. It was all one hand, all one careful rhythm. The sundries personal lines were not squeezed in or added later. They appeared exactly where they should, in date order, as though they belonged there. She considered the possibilities with her usual gentle logic. Perhaps Mrs. Harrow simply had no private notebook and preferred to keep everything in one place. Yet that seemed unlikely for a woman so orderly. Most housekeepers maintained a small personal memorandum for hairpins, stamps, the occasional length of ribbon. Perhaps the sum was not truly personal at all. Perhaps it covered some small household errand she preferred not to detail. But then why label it personal? Why repeat it so exactly month after month? Or perhaps, and here Miss Marple's thoughts paused, the regularity itself was the point. A fixed payment made at fixed intervals, recorded where it could be seen if anyone ever looked closely. Not hidden away in a locked drawer, but hidden in plain sight among the coal and the candles. A small shield of transparency around something that needed to remain private. She closed the ledger softly and returned it to the knitting bag. The fire had burned lower now. The room felt warmer, safer. Outside, an owl called once from the elm trees, a soft, lonely sound in the night. Miss Marple took up her knitting again. The sock grew steadily under her fingers. She did not feel urgency or suspicion, only the calm certainty that comes when one small inconsistency refuses to lie down quietly with the rest. £30 a year drawn in neat installments of 12 shillings and sixpence. A sum that had not disturbed the household budget. A sum that had been entered with perfect honesty, and yet with perfect secrecy. She smiled to herself, a small, thoughtful smile. Small contradictions she had learned long ago were often the keys to larger understandings, not crimes, perhaps, not even wrongdoing in the usual sense, but something human, something guarded, something that asked to be understood rather than condemned. The clock on the mantel struck 10. Miss Marple wound her wool neatly, set the sock aside, and carried the teapot to the kitchen to rinse. Tomorrow she would return to Willowmere, not to accuse, not to question sharply, but simply to observe a little longer, to listen a little more carefully. For now, and the ledger rested quietly in her bag, its pages full of figures that told one story on the surface and quite another beneath. And in the stillness of her cottage, with the fire dying to embers and the village asleep, Miss Marple felt no need to hurry. The truth, she knew, would reveal itself in its own time, gently, quietly, as all true things do. Chapter 5. A Detail Revisited. Approximately 1,000 words. The next week passed in the usual gentle rhythm of St. Mary Mead. A light snow dusted the rooftops one morning, melting by noon. The butcher's boy delivered extra sausages to several houses. The vicar's wife organized a small collection of woolens for the children's home in the next town. Miss Marple went about her days as always, tending the few hardy plants still brave in her garden, knitting by the fire, and exchanging small pleasantries over garden fences. Yet all the while the borrowed ledger rested on her small table, its black cover a quiet presence, waiting. On the Thursday following her last visit to Willowmere, Mrs. Price sent another note, short, gracious, written in the same slightly tremulous hand. Dear Jane, I find I am expecting a cousin from Bath next week and should like the house looking its best. Would you care to join us for tea on Saturday afternoon? Mrs. Harrow has promised her special lemon curd tarts, and I should so enjoy your company. No need to bring anything. Your presence is gift enough. Miss Marple accepted with pleasure. Saturday arrived, clear and cold. She walked the short distance to Willowmere wrapped in her warmest coat, in a small posy of winter jasmine from her own garden tucked into her knitting bag as a token. The gate stood open, the drive freshly raked, the windows gleaming. Mrs. Price greeted her in the hall with a kiss on the cheek and led her at once to the morning room, where the fire burned brightly and the tea tray waited. The lemon curd tarts were indeed excellent, tart and sweet in perfect balance, the pastry crisp and golden. Conversation flowed easily. The cousin from Bath who was bringing news of a new grandniece, the difficulty of keeping brass polished in damp weather, the rumor that the railway might finally extend a branch line closer to the village. Mrs. Price seemed more at ease than on previous visits. The small restlessness she had confessed earlier appeared to have quieted. After tea, when the cousin had gone upstairs to rest after the journey, Mrs. Price excused herself briefly to speak with the gardener about the pruning of the roses. Miss Marple was left alone in the morning room with the fire crackling softly and the faint scent of lemon lingering in the air. She rose quietly and moved toward the housekeeper's pantry, a small room opening off the passage just beyond the morning room. The door stood ajar. Inside, everything was as orderly as one would expect. Shelves held jars of preserves neatly labeled, stacks of clean tea towels, a row of polished copper pans. On the dresser stood the familiar small locked drawer where housekeepers often kept private odds and ends. Receipts, a spare key, perhaps a few personal letters. Beside the drawer on the same shelf lay a worn envelope of thick cream paper, and it had been placed carefully, not thrust in haste. The address was written in a firm but youthful hand. Mrs. A. Harrow, care of Willowmere, St. Mary Mead. The postmark, though faded, was still legible, 4 years earlier from a small market town some 30 miles distant. The envelope had been slit open neatly along the top edge, and then resealed with a thin strip of gummed paper, the kind used for mending rather than hiding. Miss Marple did not touch the envelope. She simply noted its presence, its careful placement, the date. Then she returned to the morning room and sat down again, folding her hands in her lap. When Mrs. Price returned, flushed from the cold garden air, Miss Marple asked if she might borrow the ledger once more. Just to confirm 1 or 2 small figures before I return it finally. Mrs. Price agreed at once, fetching the book herself from the escritoire. Back in her own cottage that evening, Miss Marple lit the parlor lamp, drew her chair close to the fire, and opened the ledger to the very first appearance of the 12 shillings and sixpence entry. Tuesday, the 10th of February, 4 years and 2 months earlier. She compared the date against the postmark on the envelope she had seen. The envelope had been posted in the same month, February of that year. A few days later, in fact. She turned back through the pages, noting the household's rhythm in those early months of Mrs. Harrow's employment. Mr. Price had still been well enough then to come downstairs occasionally. There had been more visitors, more small entertaining, a few extra entries for cakes and flowers. Yet the accounts remained balanced, the cash box correct, and now the small detail, the repeating sum, the regular interval, gained a new, clearer meaning when placed beside the postmarked envelope. 12 shillings and sixpence had been, 4 years ago, almost precisely the cost of a second-class railway return ticket to that small market town. Fares had risen since, of course, but in those days the figure matched closely. Enough for the journey there and back, with perhaps a shilling or two left over for a modest meal or a small parcel. Every fourth Tuesday, not random, not careless, a fixed schedule, perhaps the one day in the month when a certain person could be visited without drawing notice, when trains ran conveniently, when half-days allowed just enough time. Miss Marple closed the ledger gently, and the contradiction she had felt earlier, the careful recording of something private in a public book, now began to resolve into something simpler, more human. Not deception for gain, not theft, but protection. A small, regular act of care, hidden not because it was wrong, but because it was vulnerable. She pictured Mrs. Harrow walking the quiet path to the old chapel, the string bag empty on the way out, lightly burdened on the return. Perhaps carrying back a letter, a small gift, a token of connection kept alive across miles and years. The fire popped softly. Outside, the night was still, the frost settling once more on the window panes. Miss Marple did not feel triumph or revelation, only the quiet satisfaction that comes when scattered pieces settle gently into place. She set the ledger aside, took up her knitting, and let the needles move in their familiar rhythm. Tomorrow or the day after, she would speak with Mrs. Harrow. Not in accusation, not in haste, but calmly, kindly, as one woman to another who understood the small, faithful ways people try to hold their lives together. For now, the borrowed book rested quietly on the table, its pages no longer puzzling but simply truthful, recording not only shillings and pence, but the steady, unseen currents of human duty and love. Chapter 6. Quiet explanation, approximately 1,000 words. The following Tuesday dawned gray and still, with a fine mist hanging over the fields beyond St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple rose early, as was her habit, and spent the morning in small, ordinary tasks, dusting the mantelpiece ornaments, checking the level in the paraffin lamp, writing a short note to thank the vicar's wife for the recipe for spiced apple chutney. By midday, the mist had lifted, leaving the air damp and cool. She put on her coat, tucked the ledger, still borrowed, still wrapped in its tea towel, into her knitting bag and set off once more toward Willowmere. Mrs. Price was expecting her. A note had arrived the day before. "Dear Jane, if you are free this afternoon, do come for tea. Mrs. Harrow has made her excellent ginger cake, and I should so value your company after the quiet week we have had." Miss Marple arrived just as the clock struck 3. The house smelled of warm spices and fresh baking. Mrs. Price greeted her warmly in the hall, cheeks pink from the kitchen heat, and led her at once to the morning room. The fire burned steadily. The tea tray waited on the low table, and the ginger cake already cut into neat slices. They talked for a little while of small things. The cousin from Bath who had returned home safely, the first snowdrops pushing through in the shrubbery, the price of wool having risen again. Then Mrs. Price set her cup down and said gently, "Jane, I know you have been looking over the ledger with such care. Is there anything at all I should know? I feel quite at peace now, but I should like to hear your thoughts." Miss Marple smiled. "The household accounts are in perfect order, my dear. Nothing is missing. Nothing is overstated. Mrs. Harrow keeps them with real skill. But there is one small matter I should like to speak of, with her permission and yours. Nothing alarming, I promise you, only something that has puzzled me a little and which I think might be explained quite simply." Mrs. Price looked relieved rather than concerned. "Of course. I shall ask her to join us." A few minutes later, Mrs. Agnes Harrow entered the morning room. She wore her usual dark dress and white apron, her hands folded neatly before her. Her face was calm, though a faint wariness showed in the set of her mouth. She stood just inside the doorway, waiting. "Do sit down, Mrs. Harrow," Miss Marple said kindly. "There is tea if you would like some." "Thank you, ma'am. I'll stand if it's all the same." Mrs. Price made a small gesture of invitation toward the chair, but the housekeeper remained where she was. Miss Marple opened her knitting bag, drew out the ledger, and laid it gently on the table between them. She did not open it at once. "My dear Mrs. Harrow," she began, her voice soft and unhurried, "I have been looking over this book, not to find fault, but because Mrs. Price wished for reassurance after her husband's passing. And I have found the accounts admirably kept. Every bill paid, every sum balanced, every detail attended to with care. You have managed Willowmere beautifully." Mrs. Harrow inclined her head slightly. "Thank you, ma'am." Miss Marple's finger rested lightly on the cover. "There is, however, one small thing that caught my attention. Every fourth Tuesday, without fail, for the past 4 years and more, you have entered 12 shillings and sixpence under sundry. Personal. The same amount, the same words, the same neat tick. It is not a large sum, and it has not disturbed the household budget in any way. Yet it puzzled me, because you are a woman who accounts for every farthing of this house. Why place something personal in the household ledger at all rather than keep it quite separate in your own private book?" A long silence followed. The fire popped once. Outside, a blackbird called from the ivy on the wall. Mrs. Harrow's hands tightened briefly, then relaxed. When she spoke, her voice was low but steady. "It was for my son, ma'am." Mrs. Price gave a small, surprised breath, but said nothing. "He made a mistake many years ago," Mrs. Harrow continued. "Not a violent one. Nothing of that kind. Only foolishness with money that belonged to his employer at the time. He was young, headstrong. He was sent away for 3 years. When he came out, he wanted to start again quietly, in a different place, under a different name, so the past would not follow him. I helped him find lodgings in a small town 30 miles from here, and I send him the railway fare and a little extra every month. Enough to keep him respectable, to help him hold a steady job without falling back into difficulty. 12 shillings and sixpence was the exact cost of the return ticket, and a modest amount besides 4 years ago when it began. Fares have risen since, but I've kept the sum the same and made up the difference from my own savings so the entry would not change." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And you entered it in the ledger rather than privately?" "So that if anyone ever questioned my honesty, if the cash box was ever short by even a penny, the record would show I had taken nothing that was not written down. Hidden in plain sight, you might say. I never wanted Mrs. Price to think I was taking from the house for my own gain. And I never wanted her to know about my son. I'm a housekeeper with a son who has been in prison. Well, people talk. Positions can be lost over less. I thought if it was there in the book, open for anyone to see, it would look ordinary. Just another regular expense. Mrs. Price reached out and touched the housekeeper's arm gently. "My dear Mrs. Harrow, you should have told me." "I couldn't bear the risk, ma'am. You've been so kind since Mr. Price passed." "I didn't want to give you any cause to doubt me." Miss Marple spoke again, her tone as gentle as before. "And the envelope in the pantry, the one posted 4 years ago from that same town?" Mrs. Harrow's eyes flickered. "His first letter after he settled there. He wrote to say he was safe, working in a small garage, keeping out of trouble. I keep it close. I don't hear from him often now. He's doing well, and doesn't need to ask for help as much, but I like to know it's there." There was no drama in the room, no raised voices, no tears. Only the quiet crackle of the fire and the soft breathing of 3 women who had known life's ordinary burdens. Miss Marple closed the ledger with care. "There is no dishonesty here, Mrs. Harrow. Only a mother doing what mothers do, looking after her own in the best way she knows. You have taken nothing that was not yours to give. You have kept this house with perfect integrity. The ledger tells that story clearly once one understands the reason behind the figures." Mrs. Harrow looked down at her hands. "I never meant to deceive anyone." "You have not deceived," Miss Marple said softly. "You have merely guarded what needed guarding. That is all." Mrs. Price spoke then, her voice warm. "You will continue here. Of course, nothing changes. And if there is ever anything you need to tell me about your son or anything else, my door is open." Mrs. Harrow nodded, a small, grateful movement. "Thank you, ma'am." Miss Marple rose. "I shall return the ledger now, if I may. It has told its story fully." She placed the book on the escritoire, patted it once, and turned to the 2 women with a quiet smile. Chapter 7. Peaceful Resolution, approximately 1,000 words. The morning room at Willowmere felt different after Mrs. Harrow's quiet confession, lighter somehow, as though a small window had been opened to let in fresh air. The fire still crackled softly, the ginger cake sat half-eaten on its plate, and the 3 women remained seated in the same gentle circle of lamplight and warmth. No one hurried to speak. There was no need. Miss Marple reached across the low table and patted Mrs. Harrow's hand once, lightly, the way one might reassure a child who has finally told the truth about a broken ornament. "My dear," she said, "you have carried this small secret with perfect honesty. The ledger never lied, not once. Every figure was true, every tick accurate. What you did was not to take from the house, but to give to someone who needed you. That is not a crime. It is simply life." Mrs. Harrow looked down at her folded hands. A faint flush had come into her cheeks, not from shame, but from the sudden relief of being understood. "I was afraid," she admitted softly. "Afraid that if anyone knew about him, they would see only the mistake he made long ago and not the man he has become. I wanted to protect him, and to protect my place here. This house are these people. They have been good to me." Mrs. Price leaned forward in her chair. Her voice, when she spoke, was warm and steady. "You have been more than good to us, Mrs. Harrow. Since Henry passed, you have kept everything running so smoothly I scarcely noticed the days passing. The house has felt safe, orderly, cared for. That is a gift I shall never take for granted again. And as for your son, well, we all have family we worry over, don't we? Some mistakes are young ones. Some burdens are carried quietly for years. None of that changes what you have done here." Mrs. Harrow lifted her eyes then, meeting Mrs. Price's gaze. A small, tremulous smile appeared, the first genuine one Miss Marple had seen on her face that afternoon. "Thank you, ma'am. Truly." Miss Marple rose slowly, smoothing the front of her dress with habitual care. "And the ledger may now be returned to its proper place on the escritoire," she said. "Its story is complete. Every entry makes sense now, not merely as numbers, but as the record of a life lived with duty and quiet kindness. A housekeeper's ledger, after all, holds more than shillings and pence. It holds the small, faithful ways people try to do right by those they love." She placed the black leather book carefully back on the desk, closed it with a soft snap, and turned to the two women. "I shall leave you now. There is nothing more to explain, nothing more to worry over. Everything is as it should be." Mrs. Price stood and took Miss Marple's hands in both of hers. "Dear Jane, how can I ever thank you? You have given me peace of mind, and you have given Mrs. Harrow something even more precious." Miss Marple smiled her small, familiar smile. "No thanks are needed, my dear. One simply likes to see things in their proper light. Good afternoon to you both." She walked down the gravel drive as the winter light began to fade, the sky turning the soft lavender of early dusk. The chrysanthemums still stood brave along the path, their heads bowed slightly under the weight of their own petals. At the gate she paused, looked back at the tall windows of Willowmere, now glowing with lamplight, and felt the quiet satisfaction that comes when order has been gently restored. Back in her own cottage, Miss Marple lit the parlor lamp, drew the curtains, and settled into her favorite chair. The fire burned low and steady. The room smelled faintly of wood smoke and the lavender sachet she kept in the drawer. So she took up her knitting. The gray sock was nearly finished now, and let the needles move in their calm, familiar rhythm. Outside, St. Mary Mead settled into evening. Lamps appeared one by one behind lace curtains. The church clock struck the quarter hour with its soft, unhurried chime. Somewhere a dog barked once, then fell silent. The village slept under a sky pricked with early stars. In Willowmere, Mrs. Harrow would finish clearing the tea things, wipe down the kitchen table, check the range for the night. Mrs. Price would perhaps sit a little longer by the fire, turning over in her mind the small revelation of the afternoon. Not with worry, but with a new, quiet fondness for the woman who had kept her home so well. And somewhere 30 miles away in a small market town, a young man would continue his steady work at the garage, he unaware for now that his mother's burden had grown a little lighter. Miss Marple finished the last row of the sock, cast off neatly, and laid the completed pair on the arm of the chair. She looked at the small gray woolen shapes for a moment, ordinary, useful, made with care, and smiled to herself. The ledger had done its work. It had recorded not only the daily life of a household, but the hidden threads of human care that hold such lives together. 12 shillings and sixpence every fourth Tuesday had not been a mystery to be solved with suspicion, but a small act of faithfulness to be understood with kindness. She rose, banked the fire for the night, and carried her teacup to the kitchen. The cottage was still, the world outside hushed. Order had returned, not through dramatic revelation, not through accusation or punishment, but through the simple, patient act of listening and seeing clearly. Miss Marple turned down the lamp until only a faint glow remained. She climbed the narrow stairs to her bedroom, drew back the curtains to let in the starlight, and slipped under the covers. The house settled around her like an old friend, creaking faintly, breathing softly. Outside, the night deepened over St. Mary Mead. The elms stood silent. The lanes lay empty. And in every cottage, every quiet home, small lives continued in their gentle, ordinary way. Sleep well, dear listener. May your dreams be calm and untroubled, your heart light, your rest deep. The day is done, the mystery gently closed, and all is peaceful once more. Good night. Chapter 8. The ledger closes, approximately 1,000 words. Several weeks passed in St. Mary Mead, with the gentle inevitability of the turning seasons. The last of the snowdrops gave way to early crocuses pushing bright spears through the damp earth. The days lengthened almost imperceptibly, and the air began to carry the faint promise of spring. At Willowmere, the routines continued unchanged, yet something in the house felt subtly different, lighter, as though a small, unseen weight had been lifted from the rafters. Mrs. Harrow moved through her days with the same quiet efficiency she had always shown. She rose before dawn to light the range, prepared breakfast trays with careful attention to detail, polished the brass door knocker until it gleamed, and balanced the cash box each evening to the last farthing. The ledger remained on the escritoire in the morning room, its black cover closed now without any sense of secrecy. Occasionally Mrs. Price would open it herself, not to check for errors, but simply to run her finger down a column or two, smiling at the neatness of the handwriting, the perfect order of the figures. She no longer felt the faint restlessness that had once prompted her to ask Miss Marple for help. Trust had returned deeper than before because it had been tested and found true. One mild Saturday afternoon in early March, Mrs. Price invited Miss Marple to tea once more. The cousin from Bath had sent a parcel of shortbread and a new book of garden verse. The kitchen still smelled faintly of ginger from the week before. Mrs. Harrow had set the table in the small conservatory this time, where the first tender shoots of ferns were uncurling under glass. Sunlight slanted through the panes, catching motes of dust in slow golden spirals, and the three women sat together with no ledger between them. Only teacups, a plate of biscuits, and the quiet contentment of ordinary companionship. Conversation drifted easily. The price of seed potatoes at the market, the new hymn the choir was learning for Easter, the way the light changed on the garden wall at this time of year. After a little while, Mrs. Harrow excused herself to fetch fresh hot water. When she had gone, Mrs. Price turned to Miss Marple with a small, thoughtful smile. "Jane, I have been meaning to tell you. Last week, Mrs. Harrow asked if she might have a day away, not her usual half-day, but a full day. She said she wished to visit her son. I told her of course she might whenever she liked. She seemed surprised and then so grateful I almost felt ashamed I had not thought to offer it sooner." Miss Marple nodded, each stirring her tea slowly. "A kind gesture, Eleanor, and timely." She returned in the evening looking quieter than usual, but content. She brought back a small pot of honey from the market near his town, said it was the best she had tasted in years. "We had it on toast the next morning. It was very good." Miss Marple smiled. "Small gifts often carry the largest meanings." Mrs. Harrow returned then with the fresh pot, set it carefully on the tray, and resumed her seat. She did not speak of the visit, but there was a new softness in her posture, a subtle easing of the lines around her eyes. She poured tea for the others with steady hands, added milk and sugar exactly as each preferred, and passed the cups without a word. Miss Marple accepted hers gratefully. "You know," she said after a moment, addressing both women, "I have always believed that a well-kept house is more than clean rooms and balanced books. It is a place where people may live honestly, with themselves, with each other. Willowmere has always been such a place. Now it is even more so." Mrs. Harrow looked down at her cup. "I shall never forget what you did, Miss Marple, not just for seeing the truth, but for speaking it so gently." "There was no need for anything else," Miss Marple replied. "Truth, when spoken kindly, needs no harsh edges." The afternoon wore on in companionable quiet. When the sun began to dip behind the elms, Miss Marple rose to take her leave. Mrs. Price walked her to the door. Mrs. Harrow followed a step behind, carrying the small posy of early primroses Miss Marple had brought as her contribution to tea. At the gate, Miss Marple paused. "I shall not need to borrow the ledger again," she said with a small smile. It has told everything it needed to tell. Mrs. Harrow inclined her head. It will stay on the escritoire, ma'am. Open for anyone who wishes to look. No more hidden lines. Miss Marple patted her arm once lightly. That is exactly as it should be. She walked home through the lengthening light, the lanes familiar under her feet. The village was waking from its winter hush. Children called to one another across gardens. A bicycle bell rang somewhere near the post office. Smoke rose straight from chimneys into the still air. At her own cottage, she let herself in, hung her coat, and lit the parlor lamp even though dusk had not yet fully fallen. The fire was already laid. She touched a match to it and watched the flames catch and spread. And on the small table beside her chair rested her knitting basket. The gray socks long finished, a new pair of mittens begun in soft blue wool. She sat down, took up the needles, and began to knit slowly row by row. Outside, St. Mary Mead continued its quiet life. Willowmere stood solid and ivy-clad on the edge of the village, its windows glowing now with evening lamplight. Inside, the ledger lay closed on the escritoire, its pages full of figures that no longer carried any shadow of mystery, only the steady record of days well lived, duties faithfully met, small kindnesses quietly given. Miss Marple knitted on, the fire crackling softly, the house settling around her like a warm shawl. The story of the housekeeper's ledger had ended not with fanfare, but with the gentle closing of a book, the turning off of a lamp, and the knowledge that everything necessary had been seen, understood, and set right. She smiled to herself, a quiet, satisfied smile, and continued her knitting as the night deepened peacefully over the village. Sleep well, dear listener. May your own ledger of days be written in kindness, your nights be calm, your heart at rest. The tale is told. All is well. Chapter 9. A Quiet Spring, approximately 1,000 words. Spring arrived in St. Mary Mead with the kind of gentleness that makes one forget winter ever existed. The elms along the lane put out pale green leaves that filtered the sunlight into soft, dappled patterns on the paths. Crocuses gave way to daffodils, then to tulips in every shade of pink and yellow. The air carried the scent of damp earth and new growth. Birds returned to the gardens, filling the mornings with unhurried song. Even at Willowmere, the change was felt in small, daily ways. The heavy curtains in the drawing room were drawn back earlier each day to let in the light. Mrs. Price took to sitting in the conservatory with her morning tea, watching the ferns unfurl and the first rosebuds swell on the canes trained against the wall. She looked younger somehow, not in years, but in the way worry no longer shadowed her eyes. The house felt lived in again, not merely maintained. Mrs. Harrow continued her work with the same steady rhythm. Yet there was a subtle difference in her step, a slight softening in her voice when she spoke to the daily girl or answered the door to tradesmen. She no longer carried the small string bag every fourth Tuesday. Instead, on those mornings, she sometimes asked Mrs. Price if she might take the full day. The permission was always given with a smile and no questions asked. When she returned in the evening, often with a small parcel, a jar of local honey, or a bunch of wildflowers gathered along the way, Mrs. Price would accept the offering with quiet thanks as though it were the most natural thing in the world. One bright Saturday in late April, Miss Marple received an invitation to luncheon at Willowmere. Not tea this time, but a proper midday meal. Cold poached salmon with cucumber sauce, new potatoes from the garden, young peas, and a lemon syllabub for pudding. The note in Mrs. Price's familiar hand read simply, "Dear Jane, it would give us both such pleasure if you would join us. No need to bring anything, your company is all we ask." Miss Marple accepted, of course. She walked the lane in her lightest spring coat, a small bunch of lilac from her own garden tied with ribbon. The gate at Willowmere stood wide open. The drive had been freshly raked, the windows sparkling. Mrs. Harrow met her at the door, apron removed, hair neatly pinned but without the usual cap. A small sign that today was different. They lunched in the dining room, the long table set with the best china and a low bowl of early tulips at the center. Conversation flowed without effort. The new vicar's habit of quoting poetry in his sermons, the success of the spring flower show at the village hall, the rumor that young Mr. Entwistle from the garage might be opening a bicycle repair shop beside the post office. After the syllabub had been cleared and coffee poured, Mrs. Price suggested they move to the garden. The three women walked out together onto the terrace, and where chairs had been arranged beneath the spreading branches of an old pear tree just coming into blossom. The air was warm, scented with earth and flowers. A thrush sang somewhere in the shrubbery. Mrs. Harrow spoke first, her voice quiet but clear. "I wanted to thank you both properly, today while the sun is shining and everything feels new again. Miss Marple, you saw what no one else did, and you spoke of it without ever making me feel small. Mrs. Price, you listened without judgment and gave me back something I hadn't dared hope for. Peace of mind and time to see my son without fear." Mrs. Price reached over and touched her housekeeper's hand. "You have given me far more in return, Agnes. This house has never felt so truly a home." Miss Marple smiled, folding her hands in her lap. Small secrets, when shared gently, it often become the strongest bonds. The ledger was never about hiding wrongdoing. It was about protecting what mattered most. Now that it has been understood, it can simply be what it always was, a faithful record of days well spent. They sat in companionable silence for a little while, watching petals drift down from the pear tree like slow snow. A bee hummed past, heavy with pollen. Somewhere down the lane, a child laughed, the sound carrying clearly on the still air. When the sun began to slant lower, Miss Marple rose to take her leave. Mrs. Harrow walked her to the gate, carrying the small bunch of lilac that had been left on the hall table. "Will you come again soon?" she asked. "As often as I am invited," Miss Marple replied, "and perhaps one day I shall bring my knitting and we can sit together in the conservatory. There is nothing so pleasant as knitting in good company on a spring afternoon." Mrs. Harrow smiled, a real unguarded smile. "I should like that very much." Miss Marple walked home slowly, the lane quiet except for the rustle of new leaves overhead. At her own cottage, she let herself in, placed the lilac in water on the windowsill, and lit the small fire though the day was mild. She took up her knitting. The blue mittens were nearly finished now, and settled into her chair. Outside, the village continued its gentle life. Willowmere stood secure on its rise, windows catching the last of the afternoon light. The ledger rested once more on the escritoire, open when needed, closed when not, a simple book that had told its story and then returned to silence. Miss Marple knitted on, row by row, the needles clicking softly in the quiet room. The fire burned low, the lilacs scented the air. And in that small, ordinary moment, everything felt exactly as it should, peaceful, understood, complete. Sleep well tonight, dear listener. May spring come gently to your own days. May small secrets be met with kindness, and may your nights be filled with the deepest, sweetest rest. The pages are turned, the ledger is closed, all is well. Chapter 10. Echoes of Order, approximately 1,000 words. Summer came to St. Mary Mead with the kind of warmth that feels earned after a long spring. Roses climbed the walls of Willowmere in great profusion, pink and crimson and the palest cream, filling the garden with scent that drifted through open windows on lazy afternoons. The village hummed with small, seasonal rhythms. Children played cricket on the green until the light failed. and the ice cream cart made its slow circuit past the church, and the river beyond the meadows sparkled under high, cloudless skies. Inside Willowmere, the house breathed easily. Mrs. Price had taken to spending mornings in the garden with a book of poetry or a sketch pad, capturing the way light fell across the herbaceous border. Her widow's black had gradually given way to soft grays and lavenders. The house no longer felt like a place of mourning, but of quiet, contented living. She smiled more readily, spoke more freely, and occasionally hummed fragments of old tunes while arranging flowers in the hall. Mrs. Harrow remained the steady center of the household. She still rose before first light, still checked the range, still entered every expense in the ledger with the same neat copper plate. But now the entries for sundries personal no longer appeared every fourth Tuesday. Instead, once or twice a month, a new line appeared. Travel to Lower Puddleton, family visit. The amount varied slightly, fares had risen again, but the description was open, unhidden. Mrs. Price signed the monthly totals without a second glance, sometimes adding a small note in the margin. Safe journey, Agnes. One warm July afternoon, Miss Marple received a handwritten invitation. Not for tea or luncheon this time, but for a simple garden gathering. Dear Jane, it read in Mrs. Price's hand, Mrs. Harrow's son will be visiting for the day next Saturday. We thought a small afternoon in the garden might be pleasant. No ceremony, only good company, lemonade, and Mrs. Harrow's strawberry shortcake. We should both be so glad if you could join us. Miss Marple accepted with quiet pleasure. On the appointed Saturday, she walked the lane in a light summer dress, carrying a small basket containing a jar of her own rose-petal jelly and a freshly baked Victoria sponge wrapped in a clean cloth. The sun was high, the air alive with bees and the distant sound of lawnmowers. At Willowmere, the garden gate stood open. Chairs had been set beneath the pear tree, now heavy with small green fruit, and a table held pitchers of lemonade and iced tea. Mrs. Price greeted her first, arms wide, then stepped aside to reveal a young man of perhaps 30, tall, quietly dressed in a good but unshowy suit, standing beside Mrs. Harrow. Miss Marple, Mrs. Harrow said, her voice steady but softer than usual. This is my son, Thomas. Thomas Harrow extended his hand. His grip was firm, his eyes direct but not bold. Miss Marple, my mother has spoken of you often. I'm very glad to meet you. And I you, Miss Marple replied, taking his hand briefly. Your mother is a treasure to this house, and to many others. They settled into the chairs. Conversation began slowly, as such meetings sometimes do, but soon found its natural rhythm. Thomas spoke of his work at the garage, simple repairs mostly, but satisfying. The satisfaction of making something run smoothly again. He spoke without bitterness of the years behind him, only with the calm acceptance of someone who has walked a long road and found solid ground at last. Mrs. Harrow listened with quiet pride, her hands folded in her lap, occasionally reaching to refill a glass or offer another slice of shortcake. Mrs. Price told stories of the village, the new organist who played too loudly, the success of the summer fete, the way the roses had never been finer. Miss Marple contributed small observations. The pattern of light on the lawn, the particular sweetness of this year's strawberries, the way a well-kept garden and a well-kept house both speak of patient care. As the afternoon deepened and shadows lengthened beneath the pear tree, Thomas turned to his mother. I've been thinking, he said quietly. I'd like to come more often, if that's all right with everyone. Not to stay, just to visit. Perhaps bring a few tools and see to any small repairs around the place. The gate hinge squeaks and the conservatory roof could use a bit of attention. Mrs. Harrow looked at Mrs. Price, who smiled at once. "We should be delighted," Mrs. Price said. "The house is always better when someone cares enough to notice the small things." Thomas nodded. "Then I'll come next month and bring my toolbox." When it was time for him to catch the evening train, Mrs. Harrow walked him to the gate. They stood talking for a moment, quiet words, a brief embrace, before he set off down the lane with a small wave to the others still seated under the tree. Miss Marple remained a little longer. When she finally rose to leave, Mrs. Price walked her part of the way. "Jane," she said softly, "I never imagined a ledger could lead to something so simple and so good." Miss Marple smiled. "Ledgers only record what people do, my dear. The goodness was always there, waiting to be seen clearly." Back in her own cottage that evening, Miss Marple lit no lamp for a long time. She sat by the open window, watching dusk settle over the village. The scent of roses drifted in on the breeze. Somewhere a nightingale began its slow, liquid song. She thought of the black ledger on the escritoire at Willowmere, its pages now free of hidden rhythms, its entries plain and honest. She thought of a mother and son no longer separated by silence, of a house that had become a true home again. Eventually she rose, drew the curtains, and lit the small parlor lamp. She took up her knitting, the blue mittens long finished, now a soft shawl in cream wool, and let the needles move in their familiar cadence. Outside, St. Mary Mead slept under stars. Willowmere stood peaceful on its rise, windows dark except for one small glow in the morning room where the ledger rested closed and calm. All was in order. All was understood. All was at rest. Sleep deeply tonight, dear listener. May your own small ledgers be written in kindness, your nights gentle, your mornings bright with simple peace. The story has found its quiet close, again and again if you wish.